She died with his name nowhere in her mouth. That is the detail that haunted Cresthold Pack for years afterward. The detail that the wolves who were present that night could never fully explain to the ones who weren't, no matter how many times they tried. Wren Hale had 2 minutes left to live, and she did not spend them on Coran Ashvale. She spent them on the children. 11 pups, trapped in the collapsed eastern nursery wing while the rogue pack's fire spread through the dry timber faster than anyone had prepared for. And Wren Hale, the woman the moon goddess had chosen for an alpha who had rejected her 2 years earlier for someone else, went into that fire anyway. Not because the pack required it of her. She held no formal rank that obligated her to that building. She was a healer's assistant, nothing more, by the official record. She could have stood at the perimeter with everyone else, watching, grieving in advance for whatever was lost. She did not stand at the perimeter. She went in. She got 9 of the 11 children out through a gap in the collapsed wall before the roof came down entirely. She did not get herself out. And the alpha who had chosen another woman, who had stood in the great hall 2 years before and spoken the rejection words to the one true mate the moon goddess had ever given him, stood at the edge of that fire and watched the woman he had cast aside die, saving children that were not, by any blood or formal claim, owed anything from her at all. He had 2 years to live with what he did before that night. He has spent every year since trying to understand what it means that she chose, with her very last act on this earth, to save his pack instead of cursing his name. If you have ever wondered what real love looks like when it has nothing left to gain, this story is going to break you open and then show you why that's exactly what it should do. Like the video, hit that subscribe button right now, and drop in the comments where you are watching from. What Wren Hale did in that fire is something this channel has never told before. Let's begin. Her name was Wren Hale. She was 22 years old when the bond arrived, 24 when it was rejected, and 26 when she walked into a burning building and never walked back out. I want to tell you who she was before any of that, because the easy version of grief makes a person into their final act. The woman who died saving children, nothing more, nothing less, a single bright moment that erases everything that came before it. That is not who Wren Hale was. She was, before any of it, an ordinary woman with an extraordinary capacity for steadiness. She had grown up in Cresthold Pack's western quarter, the only daughter of a woodworker and a seamstress, in a small house that always smelled like cedar shavings and the specific, warm smell of fabric being pressed. She had no particular bloodline distinction, no claim to status, no expectation that her life would intersect with the pack's governance in any significant way. She had wanted, since she was young, to be a healer, not the head healer. She had never been driven by ambition in the way that some wolves were driven, the specific hunger for advancement and recognition. She had simply wanted to be useful in the particular way that healing allowed, the quiet, daily usefulness of tending to people when they were at their most vulnerable. She apprenticed under Cresthold's head healer, a meticulous woman named Faye, starting at 16. By 22, she had become Faye's most trusted assistant, not yet a fully credentialed healer in her own right, but close, with the kind of hands-on competence that came from 6 years of careful, attentive practice. She was, by every account from the wolves who knew her, kind in the specific way that required no audience. The kind that showed up in small, consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures, sitting with frightened patients longer than strictly necessary, remembering the small details of people's lives that made them feel genuinely seen, never speaking unkindly of anyone even when unkindness would have been easy and justified. She had loved the pack's children with a specific, unguarded devotion. This detail matters more than any other in this story. I am going to return to it. The bond arrived when she was 22, during a pack gathering in the autumn, when Coran Ashvale, recently confirmed as Cresthold's alpha following his father's retirement, 26 years old, and carrying the particular weight of new authority, reached across a table to hand her a dish at the communal meal. Their hands had touched. The bond had snapped into place with the sudden, total certainty that every wolf who has experienced it describes in the same exhausted, inadequate language. A door opening, a lock turning, something that had no precedent and required none, because it announced itself with absolute clarity. Wren had gone still. Coran had gone still. The entire communal hall had felt the specific shift in the ambient pack bond that occurred when an alpha's mate bond manifested. The collective, biological awareness that something significant had just happened, even among wolves who could not have named what they were sensing. For a moment, it had seemed like the beginning of an obvious, uncomplicated story. The alpha and the healer's assistant. The bond, recognized and celebrated. The kind of pairing that wolf packs told stories about for generations, precisely because it carried no political complication, no resistance, nothing standing between the moon goddess's designation and its fulfillment. It should have been simple. It was not simple, because Coran Ashvale was already, in the private architecture of his own heart, in love with someone else. Her name was Petra Voss, and she had been Coran's closest companion since they were children, not romantically, not at first, but in the deep, foundational way that some friendships became, over years, the thing a person measured all other relationships against. She was the daughter of Cresthold's senior council member, a position of genuine standing in the pack's governance structure. She was sharp and capable, and had spent years working alongside Coran in the specific, practical business of pack administration, territorial disputes, resource allocation, the unglamorous daily work of governance that built a particular kind of intimacy between two people who saw each other functioning under pressure. Coran had been, by his own later admission, in love with her for years before the bond arrived. He had not acted on it. There had always been a reason not to. The timing was wrong. His father's retirement was imminent and required his full attention. Petra herself had seemed, for years, uncertain about whether she wanted what he wanted. And then the bond had arrived, attached to a different woman entirely, and Coran Ashvale had been forced to confront a question that few wolves ever had to face with such immediate clarity. What do you do when the moon goddess's choice and your own heart's choice are not the same? He did not handle this well. I want to be honest about that, because the easy version of villainy makes Coran a simple monster, a man who carelessly discarded a good woman for a more convenient option. That is not entirely accurate either. What he was, in those early months after the bond's arrival, was a man in genuine crisis, torn between a biological certainty he had not asked for and a years-long emotional commitment that felt, to him, more chosen and therefore more real. He spent 8 months trying to reconcile the two. He spent time with Wren, formal courtship visits, the kind that the bond's recognition required as a matter of pack tradition, getting to know the woman the moon goddess had selected. And he found her, during those 8 months, to be exactly what everyone who knew her had described. Kind, steady, genuinely good in a way that was rare and should have been impossible to walk away from. He also spent time with Petra, and found that the years-long pull toward her had not diminished simply because biology had pointed elsewhere. He confessed this to Wren directly, in the 9th month, in a conversation that several pack members who were present nearby described, years later, as one of the most painful things they had ever witnessed without being part of. He told her he could not, in good conscience, formalize the bond while his heart remained divided. Wren had listened to all of it. And then she had said something that the wolves who heard about it later, secondhand, through the pack's careful information network, found almost impossible to believe, given what it cost her to say. She had said, "Then you should be honest about that. With both of us. I would rather know the truth than live inside a kindness that isn't real." She had not begged him to choose her. She had not argued that the bond's authority should override his feelings, though she would have been within every right, by pack tradition and by biological law, to make exactly that argument. She had simply asked for honesty. And honesty, in this case, meant rejection. The formal rejection ceremony took place 3 weeks later. Wren attended, as pack tradition required of the rejected party, a detail of wolf custom that many outside observers found needlessly cruel, but which the old text justified as a necessary act of witness, ensuring that a rejection could never be quietly erased or disputed later. She stood in the great hall. She watched Coran speak the formal words, the old, irreversible words that severed the bond completely, the specific biological violence of a connection built to be permanent being deliberately torn apart. She felt it happen. I have read 3 separate accounts from wolves who were present, and all 3 described the same thing. Wren Hale did not cry. She stood with her spine straight and her hands folded, and when the formal words were finished, she nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement, and walked out of the hall with the specific, contained dignity of someone who had decided, somewhere in the preceding 3 weeks, that she was not going to give her pain a public audience. Petra Voss became Cresthold's formal companion to the Alpha within the year, not yet his Luna, because pack law required a specific waiting period following a bond rejection before any subsequent formalization could proceed, a tradition designed to ensure that rejections were not made hastily or for the convenience of an already decided alternative. Wren continued her work. This is the part of the story that the easy, dramatic version often skips past, because it is not dramatic. It is simply true, and the truth is this. Wren Hale did not leave Cresthold. She did not retreat from public life or nurse a visible, performed grief. She went back to the healing house the day after the ceremony, and she continued her apprenticeship under Faye, and she continued tending to the pack's wolves with the same quiet, consistent kindness that had always characterized her. She did this for 2 years. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the most important fact in this entire story, more important even than what came at the end. She stayed. She stayed in the pack that had witnessed her rejection. She stayed in proximity to the man who had chosen someone else and the woman he had chosen. She continued doing the quiet, essential work of caring for the community that had watched her be cast aside. And she did it without bitterness that anyone could ever document. Faye, the head healer, said later, in the careful, considered way she said most things, that she had watched Wren closely in those 2 years, looking for the cracks that grief usually produced, the small signs of resentment or withdrawal that even the most disciplined people eventually showed. She never found them. She loved this pack, Faye said, years later, to anyone who asked. Not Coran specifically, not anymore. She had done the difficult work of separating her love for him from her love for the place and the people. She loved Cresthold. And that love didn't require the bond to be honored in order to be real. Petra and Coran's formal Luna ceremony took place in the 2nd year, once the waiting period had concluded. Wren attended this ceremony too, not because tradition required it this time, but because, by her own account to Faye, she had decided that absence would have been its own kind of statement, and she did not want her presence in Cresthold to be defined by what she avoided. She stood in the back of the hall. She watched Petra become Cresthold's Luna. And those who were near her that day reported that her expression was something more complicated than simple sorrow, a kind of settled, peaceful witnessing that suggested she had, in the 2 years since her own rejection, arrived somewhere genuinely different from where she had started. I do not think she had stopped loving Coran entirely. I want to be honest about that, because the alternative, that she had simply moved past it cleanly, with no residual feeling, would make what she did at the end less remarkable, not more. The old wolf medicine texts are clear that a rejected bond does not simply disappear. It alters, it quiets, but it remains, in some diminished form, for the rest of a wolf's life. She had loved him. She had also built, in 2 years, a life and an identity that did not depend on that love being returned. That distinction matters enormously. The attack came on a night in early winter, 8 months after Petra's formal installation as Luna. A rogue pack, displaced from their own territory after a brutal internal succession conflict, desperate and disorganized in the specific way that displaced packs sometimes became, crossed into Cresthold's eastern boundary under cover of darkness, seeking territory, resources, anything that might stabilize their collapsing situation. They were not a large force. Cresthold's boundary patrol, under normal circumstances, would have repelled them without significant difficulty. But the rogues, in their desperation, did something that Cresthold's defensive planning had not adequately accounted for. They set fires. Multiple fires, simultaneously, along the eastern boundary, in the specific, chaotic strategy of attackers who understood they could not win a direct confrontation, but might create enough confusion and damage to force a negotiated retreat in their favor. One of those fires reached the eastern nursery wing. The nursery wing housed Cresthold's youngest pups, the pack's newest generation, gathered together each evening under the care of 2 senior nursery attendants, in a building that had been constructed with careful attention to safety, but had never been tested against the specific, devastating speed of a deliberately set fire in dry winter timber. By the time the alarm spread through the pack, the nursery wing's main structure had already begun to collapse. 11 children were trapped inside. Wren Hale was in the healing house when the alarm came, preparing emergency supplies for what was already becoming, in the first chaotic minutes, a significant crisis. Faye had sent runners throughout the pack compound, gathering every healer and healer's assistant for what was certain to be a long, difficult night. Wren heard the specific report: Eastern Nursery, fire, children trapped, and she did not wait for instructions. She ran. Several wolves who saw her in those moments described the same thing. She was not running toward the fire with the desperate, undirected panic of someone overwhelmed by crisis. She was running with the specific, focused urgency of someone who had already calculated, in the seconds available to her, exactly what needed to happen and understood that every additional second of delay reduced the number of children who would survive. She reached the nursery wing before the formal rescue teams had finished organizing. The structure was already partially collapsed. The 2 nursery attendants, both injured, one severely, had managed to get themselves and 3 children out through the main entrance before the central support beam came down, blocking the only obvious exit and trapping 8 remaining children in the wing's rear section. Wren found a gap, a section of the eastern wall, weakened by the fire but not yet fully collapsed, with a space just large enough for a person to crawl through if they were willing to move quickly and accept significant risk. She did not hesitate. She crawled through the gap into the burning building. What happened in the next several minutes has been reconstructed, in the years since, from multiple accounts. The children she rescued, old enough now to describe what they remember, the wolves who were positioned closest to the building and could see, through the smoke and the gaps in the structure, fragments of what was happening inside, and Faye, who arrived at the scene shortly after Wren went in and who coordinated the rescue effort from outside with the specific, controlled focus of a healer managing a crisis she could not fully control. Wren found the 8 trapped children in the rear section, huddled together in the specific, terrified stillness that very young children sometimes fell into when overwhelmed beyond their capacity to process. She did not panic them further. The children who survived to describe this, years later as young adults, all remembered the same thing: her voice. Steady, calm. The specific, practiced calm of a healer who had spent years learning to project safety into rooms that did not feel safe. She told them they were going to play a game. A crawling game, low to the ground, where the air was cleanest. She organized them, the oldest holding the hand of the youngest, moving in a careful chain toward the gap in the wall she had come through. She got the first 6 out within minutes. The 7th and 8th children, twins, 4 years old, the youngest in the group, had become separated in the chaos, pinned in a corner where a fallen support beam had created an accidental shelter that was also, devastatingly, a trap. Wren went back for them. This was the decision point. The wolves outside, who could see fragments of what was happening, reported that the structure's remaining stability was deteriorating rapidly in those final minutes, that any reasonable assessment of risk would have suggested retreating with the 6 children already saved rather than returning for the final 2. Wren did not retreat. She freed the twins from beneath the fallen beam, an act that, Faye later determined from the injuries Wren sustained, required physical exertion well beyond what her body should have been capable of producing, a specific, desperate strength that adrenaline and absolute necessity sometimes generated in moments of extremity. She got both twins to the gap in the wall. She pushed them through, and the roof, weakened beyond its final point of structural integrity, came down in the same moment she turned to follow them out. Coran Ashvale was at the perimeter when it happened. He had been coordinating the broader defensive response against the rogue pack's incursion, managing the boundary patrol's counterattack, while the fire crisis unfolded simultaneously in the nursery wing. He arrived at the burning building in the final minutes, too late to assist directly, in time only to watch. He watched the gap in the eastern wall, where 6 children had already emerged and where Faye and 2 other healers were receiving them, checking for injuries, moving them to safety. He watched the twins emerge, pushed through the gap by hands that were no longer visible behind them. And he watched the roof collapse in the same instant, with a violence and finality that made clear, to everyone present, that no one remaining inside that structure had survived. I am not going to describe what his face looked like in that moment, because the wolves who were present and who later tried to describe it all eventually gave up, saying the same thing in different words. There was no adequate language for it. What I will tell you is what he did in the hours that followed, because it matters for understanding the rest of this story. He organized the recovery of her body himself. He did not delegate it. He did not allow anyone else to take on the task, despite Faye's gentle insistence that he should not have to bear that specific weight, given everything else the night required of him as Alpha. He went into the wreckage himself, once it had cooled enough to be safely accessed, and he found her. And the wolves who were present for that, a small group, because he had asked for privacy, said that he knelt beside her for a long time before he allowed anyone to help him carry her out. The funeral took place 4 days later. Cresthold Pack's entire population attended. All 400 wolves, gathered in the great hall where Wren had once stood and watched Coran reject her, now gathered to honor the fact that she had given her life for 8 of the pack's children. The 9 children she had saved, including the 7 who survived the entire ordeal, since one of the original 3 rescued by the nursery attendants had also required Wren's specific intervention in the chaos before the main rescue, by some accounts, were present, seated in the front row with their families. Coran spoke. This was not pack tradition. Alphas did not typically speak at the funerals of pack members outside their immediate family or formal companions. But he had requested the right to do so, and the council had granted it without hesitation, understanding that what had happened required some acknowledgement beyond the standard funeral rites. I am going to share what he said, as closely as the multiple accounts that survive allow me to reconstruct it, because it is the moral center of this entire story. 2 years ago, he said, I stood in this hall and I told this woman that I could not honor what the moon goddess gave me. I told her that my heart belonged somewhere else, and I asked her to accept a rejection that I knew, even as I spoke the words, was going to cause her pain that I could not fully measure. He paused for a long time. She accepted it with more grace than I deserved. She stayed in this pack. She continued her work. She never spoke an unkind word about me, not once, in 2 years, even though she had every right to. Another pause. And 4 nights ago, when this pack's children were trapped in a burning building, she did not hesitate. She did not calculate whether she owed this pack anything, after what this pack's alpha had done to her. She went into that fire because the children needed saving, and she was capable of saving them, and that was the entire calculation she made. His voice, by the accounts that survive, broke at this point. I do not know what to do with the fact that the woman I rejected loved this pack, loved all of you, more purely and more completely than I have ever managed to love anything. I do not know what to do with the fact that she died with 9 children safe because of her, and I am still here, having to live with what I did to her and what she did, in the end, despite it. He looked, by every account, directly at Petra during the final part of what he said. I am not going to pretend this changes nothing about the life I have built since the rejection. Petra is my Luna, and that bond, though different from the one I broke, is also real, and I am not going to dishonor it by pretending otherwise in this moment of grief. A pause. But I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what Wren Hale did for this pack. Not for me, for all of you. Because she did not save those children to make a point about my failures. She saved them because that is who she was, completely, without any agenda beyond the goodness that was simply, entirely her nature. What happened to Cresthold Pack in the years that followed is the part of this story that I think matters most, because it is the part that demonstrates what Wren Hale's death actually meant. Not as a tragic, isolated act of heroism, but as something that fundamentally reshaped the community she gave her life for. The 9 children she saved grew up knowing exactly what she had done for them. Their families ensured this, not through morbid repetition, but through the specific, careful tradition that Cresthold developed in the years following her death, of telling her story at each child's coming-of-age ceremony. Not as a burden of obligation, but as an example of what the pack's deepest values looked like in practice. The healing house where she had trained was renamed in her honor, the Hale Healing House, a designation that Faye herself proposed and the council approved without debate. And Coran Ashvale, in the years that followed, became known throughout the Northern Territories as an alpha whose governance was defined by a specific, unusual quality. An almost obsessive commitment to protecting the pack's most vulnerable members, particularly its children, regardless of cost or political inconvenience. This was not coincidence. He restructured Cresthold's emergency response protocols entirely in the year following the fire. New construction standards for the nursery wing and all communal buildings, new training requirements for boundary patrol that emphasized early threat detection specifically to prevent the kind of surprise incursion that had caused the tragedy, new emergency evacuation procedures that every pack member, regardless of rank, was required to know. He funded, from his own personal resources rather than the pack's general treasury, a permanent healer's training scholarship in Wren's name, ensuring that any young wolf in Cresthold who wanted to follow the path she had followed would never lack the resources to do so. And he visited her grave, by Faye's account, every month for the rest of his life. Petra Voss, his Luna, did not resent this. I think this detail surprises people when they first hear it, because the easy narrative assumes that a wife would feel threatened by her husband's enduring devotion to the woman he rejected for her. That is not what happened, and understanding why requires understanding something about Petra that the simple villain framing of her, in the early part of this story, does not capture. Petra had been present at the funeral. She had heard what Coran said. She had watched the pack's grief, and she had understood, in that moment, something that she later described to Faye in a private conversation that Faye chose to share years afterward, because she believed it mattered for the full truth of this story. I realized, Petra said, that I had spent 2 years being quietly afraid that I had taken something from Wren that wasn't mine to take. And watching what she did, watching her choose this pack's children over any bitterness she might have justly carried toward us, I understood that she had never been my rival in the way I had assumed. She had simply been better than both of us, in a way that made comparison meaningless. Petra herself became, in the years following the fire, one of the most active supporters of the children's protection initiatives that Coran established. Not from guilt, by her own account, but from genuine respect for what Wren had demonstrated was possible, the specific, total commitment to a community's well-being that transcended personal grievance entirely. The pack bond, which had felt subtly strained in the years following Wren's rejection, a quality that several elder wolves had noted without being able to fully articulate its cause, strengthened noticeably in the years after her death. Faye, who had spent decades studying the ambient connections between pack members and pack governance, offered an explanation that the pack's historical records preserved. A pack feels it, she said, when an injustice goes unaddressed. Not consciously, not in a way that most wolves could name. But the ambient bond registers wrongness the way a body registers illness before the symptoms become obvious. What Wren did, the sheer, unanswerable goodness of it, it did something to this pack's collective spirit that nothing else could have. It forced an accounting. It forced all of us to understand, completely and without ambiguity, who she had actually been. And in understanding that, something that had been quietly broken began to heal. I want to tell you about the twins she saved last, because their story is the one that, in my research for this telling, affected me most deeply. Their names were kept from public record in their childhood, by their parents' request, to protect them from becoming symbols rather than simply children who had survived something terrible. But as adults, both chose to speak publicly about what they remembered, understanding that their story was part of a larger truth that deserved to be told completely. They remembered her voice. Not her face clearly. They had been 4 years old, and the smoke and chaos had made clear visual memory difficult to retain. But her voice, they both said, independently, in interviews conducted years apart, had stayed with them their entire lives. Steady, calm, telling them they were playing a game. One of the twins became a healer. This was not, she said later, a coincidence or an unconscious tribute. It was a deliberate choice, made when she was old enough to understand fully what had happened and who had saved her. She apprenticed, fittingly, at the Hale Healing House, under healers who had themselves trained under Faye, carrying forward the specific tradition of care that Wren had embodied. I exist, she said, in an interview conducted in her 30s, because a woman who had every reason to hate this pack chose, instead, to save it. I have spent my entire life trying to understand what kind of person makes that choice. I don't think I will ever fully understand it. I think I will spend my whole career trying to be worthy of it instead. There is something the old wolf traditions say about love that is not returned. Not the bitter, diminished version of that idea. The assumption that unreturned love is simply wasted, a failed investment that produces nothing of value because it does not achieve its desired outcome. The old traditions say something more complicated and, I think, more true. They say that love which asks for nothing in return, which continues to act with goodness and generosity even when it receives no reciprocal devotion, is not a lesser form of love. It is, in some ways, the purest form, because it has been stripped of any transactional quality, any expectation of return that might otherwise contaminate its motives. Wren Hale loved Coran Ashvale, for a time, in the ordinary way that the bond produced, with hope, with the expectation of mutual devotion, with the specific architecture of romantic partnership that the moon goddess's designation implied. That love was rejected. But what grew in its place was not bitterness, and it was not the hollow absence of feeling that sometimes follows devastating loss. What grew in its place was something larger, a love for the pack itself, for the community and the children and the specific, daily texture of a life she had built independent of whether the man at its romantic center had chosen her. That love asked for nothing. It simply acted, when action was required, with the full force of everything she had. And in the final accounting, in the way Cresthold Pack tells this story now, generations after it happened, to every child who asks why the healing house bears her name, that love is remembered not as a tragic footnote to a romance that failed, but as the central, defining truth of who Wren Hale actually was. The bond was never the most important thing about her. It was simply the thing that brought her briefly, painfully, into a story that was always, in the end, about something larger than romantic destiny. It was about what a person chooses to become when destiny disappoints them. It was about the specific, unglamorous, daily courage of staying kind in a community that has hurt you. It was about running into a fire for children who owed you nothing, because you had decided, long before that night, that love without conditions was the only kind of love worth having. Coran Ashvale led Cresthold Pack for 31 more years after that night. By every account, he was remembered as one of the most effective and deeply respected alphas in the Pack's 300-year history, not primarily for any singular political achievement, but for the specific, sustained quality of care that defined his governance from the year of the fire onward. He never spoke publicly about Wren again after the funeral, but every year, on the anniversary of the fire, Cresthold Pack held a quiet ceremony at the rebuilt nursery wing, now a stronger, safer structure that had protected 3 more generations of the Pack's children in the decades since. The ceremony required no speeches. Just the Pack's children, gathered with their families, placing flowers at a small memorial stone that bore a single inscription. She went in anyway. For words. The entire truth of who she had been, distilled into the specific, irreducible fact of a choice she made when she had every reason not to. If you have stayed with this story from the Great Hall to the burning nursery wing, from the rejection to the 4 words on a memorial stone, then you already understand what I am about to say. This was never a story about a woman who lost. It was a story about a woman who chose, again and again, to give everything she had to a place that had not always given her what she deserved in return. That is not weakness. That is the rarest, hardest kind of strength there is. Wren Hale did not need Coran Ashvale to choose her in order to be extraordinary. She was already extraordinary. She simply needed a fire, and 11 children, and 2 minutes, to show the entire world what had been true about her all along. This channel exists every single week for everyone who has loved without being chosen back, who has stayed kind in places that hurt them, who has wondered whether goodness without reward means anything at all. It means everything. It is the only kind of goodness that is real. Subscribe. Hit that bell. Drop your location in the comments. I need to know where in the world someone needed to hear that their unrewarded love was never wasted. It was never wasted. It never will be. The next story is already waiting. It starts with someone who gives everything and receives nothing in return, and ends with the entire world finally understanding what that person was worth all along. Don't miss it. See you there.